Trump's steel tariff strategy is crumbling, and Canada is turning the tables on what many are calling economic bullying has finally hit a wall.
Was the promise that he ran on. Now those elbows have come down. The American tariffs have doubled. We have by far the weakest economy in the G7. 86,000 people have lost their jobs. And the Prime Minister went pathetically to the White House to offer $1 trillion gift, bowing before the president in weakness. $1 trillion, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of the last election, where in his platform did he promise to give $1 trillion of our investment dollars to the Americans?
I would like to inform the Leader of the Opposition that there is a thing called the private sector. The private sector makes decisions about investment. The private sector, with the best deal in the world, will invest in this country and we will build Canada strong.
How can he sit right there?
The U.S. president, who once boasted about making Canada the 51st state, is now desperately seeking sectoral agreements after his punitive 50% tariffs backfired spectacularly. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just outmaneuvered Trump with a masterful diplomatic play that's leaving Trump scrambling for new solutions.
We'll start today with that high-stakes meeting in the Oval Office. Prime Minister Mark Carney was in Washington this week for his second in-person White House visit with U.S. President Donald Trump. But despite months of ongoing talks, Carney came home again without a new deal, though he's promised material progress has been made. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, meanwhile, threw cold water on the idea of a comprehensive deal on autos this week, telling the audience at a Canada-U.S. summit that the U.S. could continue buying parts from Canada, but, quote, that's about it. So where does the relationship stand now, and how likely or unlikely is a new deal? Industry Minister Melanie Joly was at that meeting in D.C. this week. She joins me now. Hi, Minister Joly. Pleasure to welcome you back to the program. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you.
I wanted to start.
It's a pleasure, Vashi. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. It's a little bit of a delay. My apologies. You just returned from Washington, D.C. and the meeting with President Trump. I wanted to ask you point blank, is there any prospect of either reductions in American auto tariffs on Canadian autos or an auto deal of any sort?
What exactly happened in that White House meeting, and why is Trump suddenly begging for deals after months of threats? To understand the dramatic shift in power dynamics.
85% of our trade with the United States is tariff-free. It is tariff-free because of discussions with the Americans, decision of the Americans signed in the Oval Office July 31st by the President, but that allows CUSMA compliant, USMCA compliant in their language, trade to be tariff-free with the exception of certain sectors. Okay, so that's reliant on USMCA. And of course, one of the questions and one of the possibilities, prospects, is that that continues under a revised USMCA, if it isn't revised. That's possible. So you need that USMCA framework to have that component. But what's also very clear,
the current trade relationship between Canada and the United States operates under a framework where 85% of trade flows tariff-free through the USMCA agreement. But strategic sectors like steel, aluminum, and autos face specific trade actions that require separate negotiations beyond this broader framework. Canada is banking on these sectoral trade deals as crucial for economic stability amid ongoing U.S. tariffs. But here's the twist. The desperation isn't coming from Ottawa, it's coming from Washington. After months of aggressive tariff threats, the tables have turned dramatically. The numbers tell the story of Trump's failing strategy. Canada supplies about 50% of U.S. aluminum imports and 20% of its steel imports. When Trump doubled his tariffs from 25 to 50%, he didn't just hurt Canada, he devastated American manufacturers who depend on Canadian materials. The Canadian steel industry, valued at 15 billion Canadian dollars and supporting over 100,000 jobs, faces an existential crisis. But Trump's tariffs have created chaos that extends far beyond Canada's borders. Canada's Minister of Industry, Melanie Joly, captured the urgency perfectly when she said, if we don't do anything short-term for steel, we may lose our plants. But this wasn't a plea for mercy, it was strategic positioning. Joly accompanied Prime Minister Carney to the White House, where they're working on deals for steel, aluminum, and energy projects. The minister emphasized they will fight for every single job in this sector.
I do want to, though, based on what you just said, in combination with what we heard from Howard Lutnick, ask you about the prospect of one. I understand that you don't want to, disclose the details of the negotiations, but do I take from what you just said and what we heard from the Prime Minister that there won't be any deal on autos anytime soon? Howard Lutnick was pretty much explicit that Canada, he said, should come second to the United States, that maybe they'll continue buying parts, but nothing really beyond that. Is that your understanding? And if so, how consequential is that?
Well, I think the only person in the U.S. administration that decides is the president himself. So you saw a positive meeting this week between the prime minister and the president. The tone was respectful, and obviously the president directed his team to work with our team to make sure ultimately that we'll land on a deal. And the challenge that the Prime Minister of Canada has, and any leaders in the world have, is to attract the attention to get
The U.S. tariffs have significantly impacted the Canadian steel industry, but they've also exposed the fundamental weakness in Trump's approach. Economic interdependence cuts both ways. The breakthrough came during Carney's second visit to the White House since becoming prime minister. What was supposed to be another round of Trump's economic intimidation turned into something completely different. Despite months of ongoing talks, Carney returned without a comprehensive new trade deal, though claiming material progress. Opposition leaders have criticized him for making concession after concession while getting nothing in return from the White House.
A couple of days in Washington to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. Both leaders described the meeting and what occurred during that trip as positive and optimistic, and that there is momentum. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister did not return with any kind of tangible deal in hand. My colleague, our senior political correspondent here at CTV News, Mike Lecouture, was alongside for that trip, covering what went down between the Prime Minister and the President. Let's start on that, main political flashpoint,
Right.
which is, what exactly did you come back with? Explain to us a little bit about what happened during the trip and why there isn't actually like here's what's going to happen to sectoral tariffs, et cetera.
Yeah, and maybe we go back to what the idea was going into the trip, right? Was that there could be some sort of relief on sectoral tariffs, specifically steel, and that is what we had thought we were going to be getting, the possibility of some sort of a movement. And of course, there were a lot of sort of adjectives to sort of downplay a lot of things, Vashi, and that's kind of where it was going.
Carney and Trump agreed to direct their top negotiators to hash out sectoral deals, prioritizing steel, aluminum, and energy. The leaders' meeting was described as successful, positive, substantive, according to Canadian Minister Dominic LeBlanc, who was responsible for trade negotiations. Trump specifically directed his cabinet members to quickly land deals, language that reveals just how desperate the situation has become for the U.S. president. This is the same Trump who once joked about Canada becoming the 51st state, now scrambling to negotiate deals that would provide relief from his own tariff policies. The White House meeting concluded with both leaders directing their cabinet members to quickly land deals focused on steel, aluminum, and energy. The strategic brilliance of Canada's approach becomes clear when you examine the broader context. While Trump has been imposing tariffs as punishment, Canada has been quietly repositioning itself to reduce dependence on American trade. Canadian companies are sending more of their products to Europe to ease their reliance on U.S. trade. Aluminary Alouette, a Quebec aluminum manufacturing company, sent 4% of its entire export to Europe in the first quarter of this fiscal year, a strategic diversification that reduces Canada's vulnerability to Trump's economic threats. But the real genius of Canada's strategy lies in how they've turned Trump's own rhetoric against him. The U.S. president has long claimed that his tariffs are about national security and protecting American jobs. Yet the reality is that Trump's 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum have effectively closed the U.S. market to Canadian producers, while driving up costs for American manufacturers. Michael Garcia, CEO of Algoma Steel, noted that the 50% tariff has effectively closed the U.S. market to us, but he also pointed out that even a reduced tariff of 10 to 15% would allow many in the Canadian steel industry, many suppliers, to re-enter the U.S. market because we are quite competitive. The economic damage from Trump's tariff war extends far beyond the steel industry. the tariffs amount to an average tax increase of nearly $1,300 per U.S. household in 2025, according to the Tax Foundation. Trump's expansions to the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, including ending country exemptions and raising the rate to 50%, have created massive disruptions in North American supply chains that took decades to build. What makes Canada's position even stronger is the recognition that Trump's tariff policy is economically incoherent. Wayne Weingarten, a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute, argues that the Trump administration has yet to fully explain the exact math behind the steel and aluminum tariffs. They've never given any justification why 25% is the right number, let alone why 50% is, Weingarten says. It was just doubled. This arbitrary approach to trade policy has created uncertainty that benefits no one, except Canada's negotiators, who can point to the chaos as evidence of why sectoral deals are necessary. The Canadian strategy becomes even more sophisticated when you consider the timing. The ongoing discussions with the U.S. encompass aluminum and energy, but they're taking place against the backdrop of the upcoming review of the USMCA trade agreement. Carney told reporters it was unlikely that one simple trade deal could resolve all the issues between the two countries, setting the stage for sectoral agreements that would persist even if the broader trade framework is revised. Trump's desperation is becoming increasingly obvious to observers. During the White House meeting, he admitted there was natural conflict between Canada and the U.S. in terms of having the same industries, such as car manufacturing. But this admission reveals the fundamental flaw in his approach. You can't have economic nationalism and economic integration at the same time. Trump wants to make American cars while also wanting Canada to do well making cars, as he put it. This contradiction has left him searching for formulas that can somehow resolve the impossible. The steel industry crisis illustrates the broader failure of Trump's trade strategy. Canadian steel exporters have warned that higher tariffs hurt both themselves and U.S. consumers. All it does is raise prices for Americans, said David Koss, president of Winnipeg-based Hunter Wire, which makes steel structures that provide foundations for thousands of arenas, including those used in the National Hockey League. The 50% tariffs have created a situation where, as one industry leader put it, we basically consider the U.S. market closed to us. But Canada isn't just playing defense. The country has implemented a strategic response that includes both retaliation and repositioning. Canada announced 25% retaliatory tariffs on goods, including steel, aluminum, computers, sports equipment, and other products worth 29.8 billion Canadian dollars in total. More importantly, Canada's new policy is to counter tariff only products where U.S. tariffs are in place, such as steel and aluminum, a targeted approach that maximizes pressure on specific sectors while minimizing broader economic disruption. The energy component of the negotiations reveals another dimension of Canada's leverage. When Trump threatened to impose 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum in March, the provincial government of Ontario suspended its planned surcharges on electricity sold to the United States. Ontario Premier Doug Ford had pointed out that his province powers 1.5 million U.S. homes and businesses, with the surcharge costing families and businesses as much as 400,000 Canadian dollars per day. This episode demonstrated that Canada has its own economic weapons and isn't afraid to use them. The broader economic context makes Trump's position even more precarious. Harvard University economist Larry Summers has put the odds of a recession at 50-50, while Goldman Sachs revised down its growth forecast for this year to 1.7% from 2.2% previously. The investment bank modestly increased its recession probability to 20% because the White House has the option to pull back policy changes if downside risks begin to look more serious. The S&P 500 stock index tumbled 2.7% in what observers called an unmistakable Trump slump that has erased the market gains that greeted his victory in November 2024. Canada's negotiating position is further strengthened by the recognition that Trump's tariffs are working against his own stated goals. Felix Tintelnot, professor of economics at Duke University, warns that the escalated tariffs will coincide with struggles in other U.S. industries. This is expected to raise the price of aluminum, which is important in inputs for downstream industries like the automotive industry, as well as construction, he explains. Yes, it does help the domestic steel sector, but hurting these other sectors of the economy, and they are already hard hit by other tariffs. The automotive sector represents another front where Canada has maintained leverage despite Trump's threats. John Diagnulo, president of Unifor Local 200, representing about 2,000 Ford workers in Windsor, Ontario, warned that tariffs could lead to job losses and cautioned that if Carney strikes a deal harming the auto industry, the union will strongly oppose it. But this isn't just about protecting Canadian jobs, it's about recognizing that the integrated North American auto industry can't be easily dismantled without massive costs to all parties. Canada's strategic patience is paying off. The progress in trade talks comes after Carney's emphasis on the importance of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement in maintaining economic stability. But rather than simply defending the existing framework, Canada is positioning itself for a post-USMCA world where sectoral agreements provide more flexibility and resilience against future trade disputes. The steel crisis has also revealed the limitations of Trump's America First rhetoric when confronted with economic reality. The Canadian Steel Producers Association fears mass disruption from the doubled tariffs, but they're not backing down. Instead, they're asking the federal government to both match the U.S.'s 50% steel tariffs and to impose tariffs that will prevent diversion of steel into our country. This is economic warfare, Canadian style, measured, strategic, and designed to maximize pressure on specific points of vulnerability. Trump's inconsistent approach to tariff policy has created opportunities that Canada's negotiators have been quick to exploit. The back and forth on tariff dates and rates has left many businesses in limbo, but it's also demonstrated that Trump's threats often exceed his ability to follow through. When he threatened 50% tariffs on Canadian metals in March, only to reverse course hours later after Ontario suspended electricity surcharges, it showed that Canada has more leverage than Trump wants to admit. The energy sector negotiations represent perhaps the most significant long-term opportunity for Canada. The country is positioning itself as a reliable supplier of clean energy at a time when the U.S. is grappling with climate commitments and energy security concerns. This isn't just about immediate tariff relief, it's about establishing Canada as an indispensable partner in North America's energy future. Canada's approach to the trade negotiations reflects a sophisticated understanding of Trump's psychological and political vulnerabilities. By framing the discussions in terms of mutual benefit and North American security, Canadian negotiators are giving Trump a face-saving way out of his self-created crisis. The language of quickly landing deals allows Trump to claim victory while actually capitulating to Canadian demands for sectoral agreements that would limit his ability to impose arbitrary tariffs. The timeline pressure also works in Canada's favor. With the USMCA review scheduled for next year, there's an incentive for both sides to establish working relationships and precedents that will influence the broader negotiations. Canada's willingness to pursue sectoral deals now positions the country to shape the framework for future trade discussions. Looking ahead, Canada's strategy appears designed to create irreversible momentum toward a more balanced trade relationship. The sectoral deals being negotiated aren't just about immediate relief from tariffs. They're about establishing principles and mechanisms that would constrain future U.S. administrations from using trade policy as a weapon. By getting Trump to agree to quickly land deals, Canada has effectively forced the U.S. president to acknowledge that his tariff strategy isn't working. The broader implications of this trade dispute extend far beyond North America. Other countries are watching to see whether economic bullying tactics can be successfully resisted through strategic patience and targeted retaliation. Canada's approach, combining defensive measures with offensive positioning, could become a model for how middle-power countries can maintain their sovereignty in the face of economic coercion from larger neighbors. Ultimately, Trump's steel tariff gambit has backfired spectacularly. What was supposed to be a demonstration of American economic dominance has become a case study in the limits of unilateral trade policy. Canada's ability to turn the tables on Trump's economic bullying demonstrates that even the world's largest economy can't simply dictate terms to integrated trading partners. The sectoral deals that are now being negotiated represent not just a victory for Canadian diplomacy, but a fundamental shift in how North American trade relationships will be managed in the future. Trump's desperate scramble for agreements after months of threats shows that Canada's strategy of strategic patience and targeted pressure has succeeded where confrontation might have failed.